Well, there it is.
There it is.
Okay. And that's a
So
revised
thank you all
picture. Those
for
are the
coming
windows.
tonight. We know that your time is valuable, so we appreciate you being here. My name is Ann Russett. I'm a planner with the city's Community Development Department. And we're here tonight to talk about an important project related to historic preservation. It's something that we call the update to Chapter 18. And we'll get into what is Chapter 18 and what that means here in a minute. But first, I just wanted to share kind of tonight's agenda and do some introductions so you kind of know the city staff that are here in the room, as well as the Historic Preservation Commission members. So again, my name is Ann Russett, and this is Jeff Hintz. Jeff and I have been kind of spearheading this project, and we're also liaisons to the Historic Preservation Commission. Jennifer Pratt is in the back. She's our Director of Community Development. And Bill Michael is the Assistant Director of Community Development. Kevin Ciabatti is the Director of Building Services. Emily Muehlbach is a Communications Manager. And Seth Gunnarsson is a planner also with Community Development. So they're going to be helping us tonight with some of the facilitation once we get to the breakout sessions. We also have some Preservation Commissioners in the room. Caitlin Hartman, Bob Grafton, and Amanda McKnight Grafton are on our Historic Preservation Commission. So, Jeff and I are going to give a brief presentation, about 20 minutes, to kind of set the framework and give you some background. And then we're going to get into the main purpose of tonight's meeting, which is really getting input from you on Chapter 18. So, that comes at...
I got a quick question for you. Show that front row light so I can see better.
Sure. Does that help?
Yeah,
Okay.
I took care of them all.
We'll turn it back up once we get to the breakouts. So from 5:50 to 6:50, we're going to do a workshop activity. Again, really getting input from the group of stakeholders here tonight. And then we'll be done. So we're going to start with a quick presentation, give you a little bit of background, talk about Chapter 18, some of the issues that we're looking at, and we'll be off into our breakout groups. So in terms of background, the first thing that we wanted to mention is that the city adopted its first historic preservation plan back in September of 2015. And the preservation plan is really the guiding policy document for historic preservation in the city. It outlines a variety of goals, policies, and initiatives related to preservation. And one of the priority initiatives in the plan is updating Chapter 18. The plan also talks about preservation and explains what preservation is. Preservation is really keeping resources intact for the benefit of future generations. It's about maintaining key character-defining features of a property, keeping historic structures in active use, and accommodating change that is appropriate over time. The plan also talks about some of the benefits of preservation. I think the obvious benefit of preservation is maintaining the city's cultural and historic heritage, our architecturally significant buildings, but there are other benefits associated with preservation as well. When you think about livability and quality of life, a lot of our historic neighborhoods were developed traditionally. They encourage walking, so there are oftentimes public health benefits of living in historic neighborhoods. The architecture in these communities create a unique sense of identity. There are also economic benefits. Property values tend to increase in historic districts. Also, our workforce is attracted and retained in communities that have a unique sense of identity. These are places where people are interested in moving to and becoming part of their community. Also, and then lastly, there are environmental benefits, and there's environmental stewardship of keeping the existing building stock, and that can help reduce environmental impacts. The city has a variety of different historic resources. We have 9 national historic districts, 40 national historic landmarks, 2 local historic districts. There's a map of those districts in the back of the room. And 1 historic landmark, which is shown here on the slide, the Osady building on First Avenue. So why are we updating Chapter 13 or Chapter 18, and what is Chapter 18? This is a term that we use oftentimes in planning and in the city. It's kind of jargony, but Chapter 18 is literally a section of the city's municipal code, and it outlines the rules and regulations for historic preservation in the city. So Jeff is going to get into some of the more specifics of what is included in Chapter 18, some of the processes, and how it works. But first, we wanted to talk about why we're updating it. One, again, it implements the Historic Preservation Plan. It also gives us an opportunity to ensure that there's consistency and clarity in our processes. Also, it gives us an opportunity to explore ways to streamline our processes. It gives us an opportunity to incorporate best practices in preservation and address concerns. Concerns raised by the Historic Preservation Commission, property owners, and other stakeholders like you in this room. And lastly, updating Chapter 18 is one way to help maintain the historic resources that make Cedar Rapids unique. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
So the historic review process is applicable to properties in the city's 2 local historic districts and our 1 landmark that was designated this year. I've got a map I'll show you in a second. So if you live in one of those areas and you're going to do something to the exterior of your house, which requires a building permit, you're required to go through the historic review process, and that's either done by the Historic Preservation Commission or by community development staff, generally me and Ann and I. Here's a map of those areas. It's generally comprised of the Wellington Heights neighborhood, and then the 1 local landmark you can see on First Avenue is the Osady building. At the top of the hill there's a nice apartment building. That was our first local landmark this year. So if you live within the bounds of one of those areas, Chapter 18 does apply to you in the municipal code, which requires that exterior changes requiring a building permit do come to the Historic Preservation Commission for review. So in terms of what that looks like, in 2014, 36 applications were applied when people wanted to do work to their properties. 11 of those went to the Historic Preservation Commission for review and were approved. 25 of those were reviewed by city staff and approved. I'll get into the differences of what would fall into each in a little bit here. Last year in 2015, 63 applications were received. 20 went to the Historic Preservation Commission, and 43 of those were approved by city staff. So in terms of recent accomplishments with regard to Historic Preservation Commission, Historic Preservation Commission liaison, these are for the applications that went to the commission for review, worked with property owners to modernize an accessory structure. That owner is actually here tonight, preserving the historic features of it. And it was proposed to be expended, so they were able to preserve the pitch of the roof and then the materials on the structure itself. So there's a picture of the finished structure. They did modernize it with the modern garage door, so the HPC is considered of those things as well. They identified options to expand an accessory structure, preserving that roof pitch. And then they continually work with property owners that go to the commission to work on cost-saving ideas and goals. They're flexible as well in areas where it's not as important on the house because they're cognizant of these things cost money and they want to work with folks. That's one of the main reasons to sign in a commission liaison. In terms of Chapter 18, it also contains the city's demolition review process. This is applicable to all primary buildings in the city, regardless if they're in a historic district or not. When there's an application for a demolition permit to knock a structure down permanently, including removing the foundation, they go to the Historic Preservation Commission for a review. Properties are required to go through this review process if they're a primary structure. There is no administrative review process for this at this time, so if you own a structure and you want to demolish it and it's 50 years older, they all go to the Historic Preservation Commission. So some stats on that. In 2014, 34 of these applications were reviewed by the commission. 28 were approved immediately and were released for demolition. The commission has the ability to place a 60-day demolition hold where they can work with the property owner if a structure is deemed historic to get them to look into some options to save the structure, do a photo documentation, or maybe apply for tax credits. Of those where a hold was placed, 3 of those were released early and they didn't actually go the full 60 days. In 2015, 44 were reviewed, 39 were approved and released immediately. 5 of these were on hold, and 3 of those 5 were released after the 60 days had expired. So that's just a little bit of background on what the demolition hold how that kind of works. So in terms of recent accomplishments, one of the ones last year within Wellington Heights, a historically significant home was relocated. This is 1257 3rd Ave. It's now been moved on to 5th Ave. I'm not sure what the address is, but it's definitely there if you go to it. So because of the hold, the HPC was able to work with the property owners. They were able to find an interested party that was interested in moving the structure, and the house was saved, and it's being renovated at this time. So some issues being explored in terms of the historic review process. This is the first thing I talked about. This would be requiring review for all exterior modifications, not just those that require a building permit. So if you come down to the permit department in this building on the second floor, there's a counter, and you try to get a permit to do something on the exterior of your house, and you're in one of the areas on the map I'd shown you, if there's not a historic review that takes place first and there's an approval, you won't be able to get a building permit until a historic review has taken place and there is an approval. One change we're looking at, we're exploring now, and that's why we're here tonight, is to get some feedback on this particularly, is requiring historic review for changes that don't require a building permit. And those things would be like windows, you're going to replace the front stairs, roofing requires a permit. Some of these things are approved administratively by staff if there's not a significant change. If there is a change or it's a major project, it does go to the commission. But we're looking at exploring a process, and we'd like to hear your input on that, on the small group, the breakout sessions, on doing that when a building permit isn't required, what your thoughts are on that. And then expanding administrative permitting, so the types of projects that staff is able to approve without going to the Preservation Commission, that are consistent with the guidelines and are altering major features on the house. We're interested in hearing from you on that tonight. And why we're doing this is that the preservation plan recommends looking into best practices, so staff and the commission have been suggesting cities and places where historic preservation is really prominent and prevalent to kind of elevate it to the top and look at ways that we can make things better for folks living in the district, as well as to be in compliance with some of the best practices and modern things that folks are doing in cities across the country in regards to preservation. Similar reasons for the demolition review process. Currently, to explain that process, some of the things we'd like your input on here tonight are allowing for the administrative review of some primary structures that are 50 years and older. You don't have any specifics on what that would look like, but we'd like to hear from you if you have ideas on that later on. And then also adding a review process for accessory structures. Right now, if you want to tear down a garage or a carriage house or a barn, it's not considered the primary structure. It's subordinate to the house or the commercial building or something. Those types of things aren't reviewed right now by the Preservation Commission. There's certainly historic elements that, you could have a carriage house or a barn that's certainly historic, which doesn't get any review by the commission at all. So it's important that we look at those things so the community doesn't lose historic fabrics. So we'd like to hear your thoughts and ideas on that. And then also adding a review process for partial demolitions. A demolition by the city, if you get a permit, it involves wiping out the basement, filling all that in. So as long as you're not doing that, it's not a demolition permit, it's some type of remodeling permit that the Building Services Office would give you, and it's obviously if you tore a house all the way down to the foundation and built something new again, it's going to look a lot different. So we'd like to hear this group's thoughts on, in the small group sessions, on some type of review for partial demolitions as well. I'll turn it over to Ann, and she's got some background for us.
Okay. So now we're at the most important part of the meeting, and why we're here tonight is because we need your input. So we want to transition into these breakout sessions. So just the tables that you're at, you can stay where you're at, and we're going to have a city staff person facilitating each discussion. What I'd like each group to do is to figure out who is going to be a note taker. We do have some commission members who will be helping out with that. And also we need to identify in each group who is going to report back. What I'd like to do is spend about 45 minutes going through some questions, giving you all an opportunity to ask questions to city staff about why we're here tonight, and maybe some questions about the presentation. And then we're going to go through the list of questions that are on these sheets. Get your input and take notes, and that information will be help us inform the changes that we make to Chapter 18. So we'll turn the lights back up and we'll get started in each group.
Yes, sir.
So if I could get everyone's attention, we're just going to spend, I know some people are still finishing up, but we want to get everyone out of here on time. And we want to give every group an opportunity to kind of share some of their thoughts and ideas and comments that came up through the discussion. So I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview, and please, my group, please feel free to chime in if I miss anything. A couple minutes on some of the things that we discussed. So we had a pretty interesting group here because all of our participants are property owners in our local historic districts. So they had a lot to say about the historic review process and a lot to say about issues in the community in general. So we spent a lot of time discussing issues related to crime, issues related to properties that maybe aren't as well maintained as others. So there was a lot of concerns that were brought up kind of in our initial discussion. In terms of the historic review process, for the question on should we require a historic review process when a building permit is not required, I think there was some understanding of the need to save architectural detail and ornamentation and the rationale behind that, but there was some concerns that this would trigger a review for things that might not be needed, like, for example, gutters. And there was a comment made about incentivizing doing the right thing, so looking at regulatory incentives, financial incentives for doing the right thing. On the demo, actually, I'll touch quickly on the second question about what could possibly be subject to the administrative review process. I think what we heard a lot is that the front really matters. Any changes on the front need to go to the Historic Preservation Commission. Changes that aren't visible from the street, maybe there could be a little bit more leeway. In terms of the demo review process, there was a lot of concern about how redevelopment can impact demolitions and how areas that are changing can result in demolitions, and there was a lot of concern about that. In terms of accessory structures, we kind of had a mixed reaction on should we have a process for accessory structures. What we heard is this shouldn't apply to every garage in the city, but for those maybe those carriage houses that are historic, it might make sense to have a process to review those demolitions. And we didn't make it to the partial demos, but did you guys have anything else you wanted to add? Okay. Great. So let's go to this group.
All right. For the first question, I'll mention at least if we touched on a subject that Ann mentioned. In terms of what preservation meant to folks, standards set forth, applicable to the masses, also folks interested in preservation. Setting a priority on old houses and neighborhoods is what preservation meant to our group, as well as preserving the identity, being unique, being different, setting the community and the neighborhoods that are historic apart from others, kind of maintaining that culture and value as a community in these areas. In terms of the historic review process, the permit not required. We said it'd be ideal to do something like that, but at the same time, it'd be hard to control if no permit is required. It would help to maintain the historic features, but maintaining some of those more intricate features can have an economic impact. It can be expensive. If it gets dilapidated, bringing those back to the historic can be more expensive. The group also said people coming out in terms of education would be okay, but don't dictate what happens on the property or over-regulate what's there. The Secretary of the Interior standards are kind of that way, which is what the guidelines are based on. But if it was more kind of a choice and there was some type of balance, we felt that education was really important about what doesn't matter. Caring properly for homes can lead to kind of a mixed look. Some folks, if there's too much regulations, won't make the changes, but other people that really do a good job, kind of the property discussion that Ann mentioned, they let their house go and they just live in it. So we need some way to enforce maintenance. We talked a lot about maintaining appearance and look of the property. Bringing back a house is expensive once it is no longer historic and those elements have been removed, so that adds to the cost certainly. And then the bottom line we kind of thought on that is people have to care, but the education would help. You can't make people care, but you can inform them about why things are important. Generally, in terms of the things that staff through the administrative review, the group generally likes the list. Things not visible from the right-of-way would be kind of problematic. Just using that definition, it needs to be flushed out a little bit. The back is not part of the main facade, but perhaps there could be some more flexibility there. We also heard it was kind of mixed in our group. The front and back should be reviewed. Certainly not demolition of accessory structures. Our group felt that should go to the commission within the historic district. The commission should have a say in how fast, in terms of the rules being hard and fast, that can be problematic. So the commission should have a say and some flexibility. In terms of the demo review, we felt as a group the commission makes good decisions. Why change that if it's working? The commission is really the experts on the buildings in town. And that they should be released. So our group wasn't, in terms of demolition review administratively, that wasn't something that our group felt good about. In terms of the second part of that, the accessory structures, we want to make sure there is a review of those historic structures. Certainly not everything is going to be historic. Maybe not saying yes or no, the commission could maybe provide some input to folks that would want to demolish one of these structures. But we would communicate perhaps and then provides an educational opportunity and provide some options. In terms of the partial demos, we couldn't really settle on a definition, not that we were here to do that tonight, but in general our group was in favor of that. It would be a good idea in terms of those. Leave it to the commission to maintain the integrity. Those are kind of the main thoughts. If everyone wants to chime in quickly from our group, if I missed anything, go for it. What's up?
All right. Just some quick highlights off the first question. As far as historic preservation, people saw value in the past, things that are unique. It's important to reference the past, honor the past, and don't tear it down and build new. There were some comments that maybe the Historic Preservation Commission should have more ability to kind of preserve the buildings that are in historic districts, but also some concerns raised about the red tape and there being too much process, and that it's sometimes difficult to navigate all the steps for getting permits and doing the right thing. So for the first kind of set of questions on the historic review process, on the first one relating to expanding the permit process for things that currently don't require permits. The group was kind of split on that. Really what we talked about a lot was that there should be more education, possibly financial support or resources. We had a good discussion about just kind of there's a difficulty in knowing who are good contractors out there, who are people who can do work in the district. Who do I go to for some of this information? If I want to do the right thing, or if I want to, keep the house historically accurate. There was kind of some debate about what sort of things maybe would require additional process, whether if that is something that was to go through, whether things like paint color should possibly be involved. With the second question on the administrative review, I think our group had a lot of positive comments on that maybe some things should be opened up for administrative review based on, or at least there should be possibly more circumstances where staff would be able to sign off on things if you're doing the right thing. But if not, then there could be an appeal to HPC. So you could still be on the same track you would normally be on, but possibly in some situations staff would be able to sign off and approve things more often. As far as demolition review, for expanding the administrative review, that the comment was that it seemed reasonable if it was in an area where we have an historic survey. The group thought that seemed okay. If we already had documentation that showed that the building being proposed to be demolished wasn't historic. The group was also, though, in favor of expanding the definition to include accessory structures under what we gave if it was older structures such as carriage houses or garages or above a certain age, that those are really tied to the structure that they're a part of and should be part of the review process. And then we kind of briefly touched on the end, but the group is also in favor of really coming up with something to tackle partial demolitions, even though they're not super common. It's still obviously demolition in the end. Do you guys have any additional thoughts, or did I miss anything?
That HPC has more teeth and more ability to implement what their recommendations are.
Okay. So that's what we have, Bill, or whoever your spokesperson is.
I think a very brief description of our conversation could boil down to the fact that we had two very clear camps in lots of the question areas. Correct me if I'm wrong. We would like to see processes simplified, but also maintain the historical integrity of the neighborhood overall. Specifically, I do know that we all agree that maybe more education for new homeowners is in order. And I also know that one of the folks that's left already likes the idea of the exterior structure permitting process.
The only things I would add to that, the very first question, we really dove immediately into the discussion of finding a balance between maintaining the historical integrity of the area and avoiding what could be considered sort of overbearing regulations. So, those were kind of the two discussion points. We were trying to find a balance between those two things almost throughout our entire conversation. And so, and that's really the trick, I think, for a lot of the updates that we're coming up with is being able to find that balance. So, I don't know, anybody else who has remained of our group? We lost our about half our group to show choir and Wellington Heights.
One thing that Seth didn't mention was some way to accommodate new technology in historic structures. Example, solar panels, so that the homes and neighborhoods can be greener.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all for reporting out. I just kind of wanted to let you know what our next steps are. So we're going to take all of this information back to the office and compile it and combine it with all of the other stakeholder outreach that we've done and use it to help inform an update. And in terms of, this is just kind of our timeline here. We're hoping to have a draft ordinance possibly in May, and we're hoping to have another public open house, which hopefully you all can attend. That'll just be an opportunity for you to see some of the changes that we made and where we're at in the process. We're hoping to get the ordinance adopted this fall. So we do have still a few more months to work on this and do more stakeholder outreach. We do have individual comment cards out on the table. If there was anything that we didn't discuss tonight that you wanted to provide some input on, please fill out a comment card. I also have my business cards out there. Feel free to email me any questions or comments over the course of the next couple of months. And again, just thank you so much for coming tonight. We really do appreciate your input. So that's all we have.
Thank you.
The only contact person I had, the house right across the street from me.